everyone, Midits here. I recently talked about the first two films in the original Diary of a Wimpy Kid trilogy. Now, we'll be moving on to the last movie, 2012's Dog Days. There's going to be quite a bit to discuss, so let's head on to the film. There are once again not a lot of new characters to mention here. There are Holly's sisters, with Heather, played by Melissa Roxburgh, being especially important in this movie. The character is shown to be very egotistical, viewing her needs to be more important than others, and we also see that Roderick has a massive crush on her. Lastly, there's a character that appeared in the first movie but was recast, that being Rowley's mom. In the first movie, she was played by Robert Capran's actual mother, Kay Capran. But as this movie has more moments that feature her, she is now played by Bronwyn Smith. That's all the new things you need to know, so let's properly delve into the movie. The film intro shows the Heffley family going to the town pool, and one thing you immediately notice is how much older Zachary Gordon looks. You can tell he had some sort of growth spurt between the time of the second movie's release and the production of the third film. And that's probably one of the reasons why this is the last movie, since you would only be able to believe for so long that not only is he a middle schooler, but that he's shorter than most of the other people in his grade. Anyway, after Greg is permanently scarred after going to the men's bathroom, we see one of the main points in the film established. The Heffleys see a teenager named Glenwood Heath who used to be a huge troublemaker, but he tells Frank they went to a military school called Spag Union and tells him how going there changed him. This causes Frank to think about potentially sending Greg to Spag Union. Greg later goes into the pool and then has the terrible realization that there are tons of kids peeing in the water. After the intro, we see that it's Greg's final day of 7th grade. One thing I found fascinating about this movie, which makes it different from the others, is the fact that it's a combination of the stories in the third and fourth book. I enjoy this since obviously this is going to be the last movie. It's nice being able to see both books being adapted rather than skipping Last Straw or not making it to Dog Days. And I also feel that it just makes more sense that there's a ton of things going on in Greg's life all at the same time. Greg tries to get Holly's number, but he's only able to get part of it before the bell rings and everyone rushes out of class. With summer beginning, Greg just plans on being home and playing video games, except he knows Frank won't like that. So as Frank arrives home, Greg pretends like he had been outside playing sports. This would have worked if Greg hadn't forgot to turn off his video game console, but then Frank sees that Greg was playing video games the whole day. Frank then gets super mad at Greg and Roderick as he unplugs the TV. Susan later tells Frank that he shouldn't be punishing Greg, but he should rather try spending more time with him and trying to bond. Although we see multiple times that it's clear Greg and Frank don't have a lot in common, Riley invites Greg to the country club Riley's family's a part of. Greg really enjoys it there since it's nowhere near as crowded compared to the town pool. Not only that, but it turns out that Holly is also at the country club. Later, Frank tells Greg they got him an internship where he works, but Greg wants to keep going to the country club, so he lies and says he got a job there. Things are looking great for Greg as he gets to spend time with Holly, and he's on great terms with Frank as he's proud of Greg for having a job. But there's one issue in that Roderick doesn't believe Greg has a job, so he tells Greg to let him into the country club, or else he'll tell Frank about his suspicions. We then see later that without getting any permission from Susan, Frank got the family a pet dog, and the dog ends up being named Sweetie by Manny. And we then see that while Greg thought getting a dog would be great, there are some clear downsides also. While at the country club, Rowley invites Greg to go to the beach with him. Roderick hears this and tells Greg that he needs to ride the cranium shaker at the boardwalk. Before Greg goes, Susan and Frank give him a phone due to the responsibility he's been recently showing, although it's a starter phone that only calls home or the police. Greg finds being at the beach house with the Jeffersons very boring, but they eventually do go to the boardwalk. We see Greg and Rowley have a lot of fun going through all the different rides and games as they wait for the cranium shaker's line to decrease. It eventually does, and they ride the cranium shaker, being absolutely mortified during and after it. The thing is, Rowley's parents had spent quite a while looking for them, and while Greg's glad that they didn't get angry at him, Rowley is sad because they said they're disappointed in him, which Rowley felt was worse than being mad. Greg is sick and tired of being at the Jeffersons' house all the time, and he accidentally calls the police on his phone. This causes an incident as the police see Mr. Jefferson holding a knife and tackle him, and so Greg gets taken home by Frank, and we see one dynamic from the books which I really like. Mr. Jefferson sees Greg as a bad influence on Rowley, while Frank sees Rowley as a bad influence on Greg. One day, Riley says he isn't going to the country club, but when Greg sneaks in, Rowley's there. And now here's one change from the book that I really like. In the Dog Days book, Greg and Rowley get into a fight, which leads to them not being friends in The Ugly Truth. Meanwhile, here, they make up way faster compared to the books. This just goes to show how the change in personality with Greg changes how events happen, with Greg being more mature and him and Rowley returning to being friends again quickly. Greg then hears about how the DJ for Heather's 16th birthday party canceled, so Greg says that Loaded Diaper could perform at the party, which she accepts. Roderick is very glad that Greg got him the chance to perform at Heather's party, as he now believes he can impress her there. One day, Frank drives Greg to his job, but when Greg enters, he sees Mr. Jefferson is upset about a huge bill he had to pay for various things Greg and Rowley bought. Then Frank enters, giving Greg his sunscreen, which he forgot, when he then finds out about the bill and that Greg doesn't work at the country club. As they drive home, we see that Frank isn't mad at Greg, he's just disappointed, which is even worse. Roderick then shows Greg that a DVD for Spag Union arrived home, meaning Frank is once again considering sending Greg there. Earlier in the film, Greg joined a Boy Scout group called the Wilderness Explorers. There's a camping trip coming up this weekend, and Greg hopes they can show Frank how responsible he is there. We see that Greg, Rowley, Fregley, and Chirag are part of that troop, and one thing I find cool about the movies is that it seems like Chirag and Fregley are kinda Greg and Rowley's friends. During the trip, we see another troop that is constantly shown as being better than theirs, and Greg and the others hear one of the adults, named Stan, making fun of Frank. Greg, Rowley, Fregley, and Chirag then hatch a plan to get revenge. They plan on filling his tent with ants and creating a web of honey that he'll run into and get stuck. While in the tent, Greg sees that Stan's been keeping a bunch of technology in his tent. Stan enters the tent and Greg hides, but he freaks out when some of the ants get on his hands. This then leads to the tent landing in a fire, and Greg is in huge trouble. The others try to defend him, but Greg takes full responsibility for the plan. But when Frank hears what the others say and sees everything in Stan's tent, he realizes why they did it. So Frank isn't upset with Greg, and Stan accidentally falls into the honey trap, not just getting stuck, but falling down a hill. Frank and Greg to a motel, and Frank tells him they won't be sending Greg to Spag Union. And we see that while there are a lot of differences between Greg and Frank, it's clear that they have more similarities with each other than they initially realized. As the summer is almost coming to a close, it's time for Heather's birthday party, and rather than playing the drums, Roderick decides that he'll do lead vocals. Roderick then sings Baby by Justin Bieber, which is as great as it sounds. They begin playing the song normally, but when Greg presses a button, they completely Loaded Diaperize the song, causing complete chaos at the party. Greg apologizes to Holly for what happened, but Holly is happy as Heather said she wanted a birthday party people would remember, and people would definitely remember this. And at the end of the party, it seems like Greg and Holly are actually together. The film then ends with Greg, Rowley, and Holly swimming at the town pool. This is a perfect ending to the trilogy. While I would have loved to see books 5 through 8 being adapted, it made sense to end it here as the actors were all getting older. One thing I found cool about each film is that it focuses mainly on one relationship in Greg's life and how Greg becomes better during those films. Rowley in the first movie, Roderick in the second, and Frank in the third. The cast here is once again incredible as always, although I want to especially highlight Steve Zahn. Similar to Roderick, I feel like they saw how great Zahn was in the previous movie and wanted to put more focus on him. Even if the real reason is just that the book they're adapting featured him as a major character, Steve Zahn delivers such an entertaining performance, and he adds a lot more layers to Frank's character. We learn about how his dad didn't try to properly bond with him, so that's why he avoided spending time with his kids. His father never taught him how. And I also love how it's actually paid off at the end of the movie, because when you see them at the town pool, you see that Grandpa is also there. We also see something that was sort of subtext in the books, with Frank having been just as unpopular as Greg when he was younger. A few times throughout the movie, we see how the character Stan viewed Frank as being weak and pathetic, and seeing this adds just so much as we see how truly similar both Frank and Greg are. I also have to talk about the development Greg has gone through throughout this trilogy. When we first meet Greg, he is incredibly self centered. He always would do things that benefited him, no matter how it affected other people. It's basically one to one to how Greg acts in the books. But they differ in that, while Greg in the books does nice things occasionally, he still is the same person throughout the whole series. Meanwhile, film Greg develops and becomes a better person throughout the story. Relationships that have been static throughout the books properly change in the movies. And I love both the books and the movies equally for these choices. The books show a more cynical look, as Greg never changes, and that's the point. It's meant to be a tragically funny story. But with these films, we see a more hopeful story where Greg changes and his life is way better because of it. Like, for example, in the books, Holly says 4 words to Greg and she isn't seen again in the whole series. Then in the films, Greg and Holly seemingly do get together at the end of the third movie. I find it so interesting how the same character goes through a completely different journey based on the decisions he made. This trilogy is incredible, and I just want to say one last thing that I would absolutely love to see a reunion or some sort of continuation with these specific versions of the characters. I feel that if we were to see any version of Greg that grows up and goes through adulthood, it should be this version, because this is the Greg Heffley that grew up. That's going to be it for this video and mini-series. This is my favorite film trilogy of all time, so I had a ton of fun. I hope you guys all enjoyed watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.